In the shadow of the First World War, when most eyes are fixed on the endless mud, trenches, and barbed wire of the Western Front, there exists another battlefield, vast, brutal, and often overlooked, where empires collided on a scale the world had scarcely imagined. And this is the story of the Eastern Front, the Russian front of the Great War, where armies numbering in the millions clashed across endless plains, forests, and snowbound landscapes, where mobility, chaos, and human suffering defined a conflict as immense as it was decisive. And it begins in the summer of 1914, when Russia, bound by its alliance to France, hurled its armies into action against Germany and Austria-Hungary, believing that numbers alone could crush its enemies before the West was won. And so the Russian steamroller began to move, two great armies pouring into East Prussia, advancing toward the heartland of the Kaiser's Reich. But what followed was not triumph, but catastrophe. For the German commanders, Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, men who would rise to fame from this very crucible, seized the opportunity to strike, encircling the Russians at Tannenberg in August 1914, annihilating an entire army, capturing 90,000 men, killing tens of thousands, and forcing the rest to scatter. A defeat so total that it echoed as one of the greatest disasters in Russian military history, a lesson in the dangers of overextension and poor coordination. Yet even in defeat, the Russian colossus remained dangerous, for unlike the narrow confines of France and Belgium, the Eastern Front stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, an ocean of land that could swallow armies whole and still demand more. And so the war became one not of static trenches, but of sweeping movements, attacks and counterattacks, victories and disasters that could change the fate of empires in a single campaign. In Galicia, the Russians struck hard against Austria-Hungary, smashing through at the Battle of Lemberg, seizing territory, and driving deep into Austrian lands, exposing the weakness of the Habsburg monarchy, whose fragile empire struggled to withstand the pressure. And soon Vienna cried for German aid, forcing Berlin to divide its strength and commit more troops eastward, setting the stage for years of grinding struggle. By 1915, the momentum shifted again, for the Central Powers, learning from their early mistakes, launched the Gorlice, Tarnów Offensive, a massive joint operation by German and Austrian forces that drove the Russians back in a great retreat, forcing them to abandon Poland, Galicia, and Lithuania, displacing millions of civilians, filling the roads with refugees, and leaving behind scorched earth and bitter ruin, a retreat so vast it redrew the map of Eastern Europe and inflicted wounds that Russia could scarcely recover from. Soldiers trudged through endless mud, their boots falling apart, their rifles outdated, their supplies inadequate, while German artillery pounded them with shells in quantities Russia could not match. And still they retreated, cursing their commanders, cursing the Tsar, cursing the endless war. Yet Russia endured, for its manpower seemed inexhaustible. Peasants drawn from the endless fields, men who had never before left their villages, now thrown into uniform, marching to a front they barely understood. And though they fought bravely, they were betrayed by poor logistics, shortages of ammunition, and leadership that faltered under the weight of modern war. By 1916, amid the desperation, one last great offensive was unleashed, the Brusilov Offensive, named for General Alexei Brusilov, a man who understood that innovation was needed, that to break the enemy, he must abandon the rigid doctrines that had led to disaster. And so he planned a surprise, training his men in secrecy, concentrating artillery, and striking suddenly along a broad front against Austria-Hungary. And the blow landed with devastating effect, tearing open the Austrian lines, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners, shattering divisions, and threatening to bring down the entire Habsburg Empire. And for a moment, it seemed Russia might yet seize victory. But Brusilov's triumph was squandered, for reinforcements never came, coordination broke down, and though Austria reeled, Germany rushed to the rescue, shifting divisions eastward and halting the advance. And what might have been a decisive turning point became instead another bloody stalemate, one that consumed lives without delivering victory. And Russia, bled white, began to collapse within. For while soldiers froze in the trenches and perished in the fields, back home the empire was rotting from within. Food shortages gripped the cities, inflation soared, strikes erupted, and faith in the Tsar withered, as Nicholas II clung stubbornly to command of the army, leaving government in the hands of incompetence and the shadowy influence of Rasputin. a symbol of decay that enraged a suffering population. By 1917, the strain was unbearable, and the front, already demoralized, cracked under the weight of revolution. Soldiers deserted in droves, peasants seized land, and the old order crumbled. The February Revolution sweeping away the monarchy, leaving a provisional government that vowed to continue the war, but could not command the loyalty of exhausted men. And when the Bolsheviks seized power in October, promising peace, land, and bread, the army dissolved almost overnight, a giant laid low by. Years of mismanagement, hunger, and despair. As the Russian front disintegrated, German and Austro-Hungarian forces advanced unopposed, seizing territory, dictating terms, and forcing the Bolsheviks to the table. And in March 1918 came the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, a brutal peace that stripped Russia of vast lands, Poland, the Baltics, Ukraine, and more, territories rich in resources, food, and people, ceded to the Central Powers in exchange for a fragile reprieve from war. It was a humiliation unprecedented in Russian history, a retreat not only from the battlefield but from empire itself. And yet it marked not an end, but a beginning. For in the ashes of defeat rose Soviet Russia, preparing for a different kind of struggle, one that would shape the century to come. The Eastern Front of World War I was unlike the Western, for here there were no endless stalemates of trenches stretching to the sea, but instead vast, shifting campaigns across territories, so immense that maps had to be redrawn with each season, where battles claimed hundreds of thousands yet left the front fluid, where mobility was both a curse and a blessing, and where the suffering of civilians, caught in the path of armies, was perhaps even greater than that of the soldiers themselves. Entire villages burned, populations deported, millions turned into refugees, wandering across frozen fields in search of safety. The strategies of men like Hindenburg and Ludendorff, masters of encirclement and exploitation, clashed with the often outdated methods of Russian commanders, who lacked the equipment and infrastructure to match modern warfare. And though individual bravery was never in doubt, the machinery of the Russian state faltered again and again, until finally it broke. The Eastern Front reshaped Europe, toppling the Romanovs, weakening Austria-Hungary, elevating Germany to temporary dominance, and planting the seeds of future conflicts, for the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk would be undone but not forgotten. And the bitterness of defeat and revolution would fuel decades of mistrust, violence, and upheaval. Yet even as history remembers Verdun, the Somme, and Ypres, the great names of the Western Front, the Eastern Front remains a vast and haunting theater, where millions fought, millions died, and entire empires collapsed in silence, overshadowed by the mud of France, but no less decisive in the fate of the war. And so the story ends, with Russia out of the war, Germany turning west for one last desperate gamble, and the Eastern Front fading into memory. Yet its legacy is written in blood across the steppes and forests, in the graves of soldiers and civilians alike, in the collapse of dynasties and the rise of revolutions, a reminder that the Great War was not one front, but many, and that on the Russian front the war was not merely fought, it was endured, survived, and ultimately transformed into something larger, the birth of a new world from the ruins of the old. History is full of battles, but the greatest one is keeping their stories alive. Subscribe, share, and like now. Never miss the moments that change the world.